Everybody, let's pick up where we left off last time, talking about the context of the 19th century leading into the 20th century. And we talked about revolutions last time. I want to talk about some accompanying what we might call forces of modernity, ideas and institutions that helped to shape the world, particularly the Western world, but because the West at this point was dominant and had all of these colonial empires and things like that, it did affect the globe more generally. The first of these, and arguably the most significant, is nationalism. The idea of a nation is really the product of modernity. It's kind of invented, at least in its most recognizable form, by Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are antecedents going back 2 or 3 centuries before that. But put simply, it's this notion that, the idea of a nation makes a connection between a land and the people who live on that land, and then the culture of the people of that land, assuming that all of these things are kind of a whole, and that is unique from other nations, right? So there's an identification of borders or boundaries, but then also the people and the culture that they produce, their language, their history, their art, their literature, their folklore, all of these things in some ways go into the idea of a nation, right? That is, as I said, largely the product of modernity. The 19th century is the great age of nationalism for Europe, at least, and by extension for the United States and other areas that are closely associated with and take their cues from Europe. There are a number of nations created during this period, most significantly Germany and Italy, which previously had been a loose conglomeration, a kind of confederation of small states, each of which had their own governments and their own traditions and things like that, right? But the shared culture and language and other things of the general area that we now think of as Germany and of Italy, these came together in the creation of these nations. The catalyst behind, or the key figure, I should say, behind the creation of Germany is pictured here on the right. This is Otto von Bismarck. And he was the chancellor of Prussia, which was one of the regions of Germany and arguably the dominant region, at least militarily and economically. But Prussia, sort of swallowed up or came to incorporate other areas like Bavaria and Swabia into this single nation by about 1870. A similar thing happened in Italy, where regions that had previously been very disparate, very divided from each other, but had a shared language and to some extent a shared culture and history. The Piedmont region and Lombardy and northern Italy, and then kind of the more rural agricultural regions of southern Italy and Sicily, right? These all came together in the 1860s. The main driving figure there was Giuseppe Garibaldi. So these all came together as nations. And of course, France and the United Kingdom and others were already kind of there, okay? Now, why is that important for understanding utopia? Well, any product of the 19th or 20th centuries that weighs in on politics at all, at least in the Western world, as all of our assignments, do, they would have been reacting in some way to the idea of nation and to these forces that were creating nations in this period. Other parts of the globe quickly embraced or were influenced by the idea of nation, often leading them then, at least by the 20th century, to try to break away from European dominance and to have their own nations, right? And this is true in parts of Europe as well that had been under the thumb of larger empires, and so the Austro-Hungarian Empire was this vast and diverse political entity that controlled, much of kind of Central and Southeastern Europe down into the Balkan Peninsula. These were all parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There were multiple languages spoken in that empire. After World War I, that was broken up into its kind of component parts, each of which was given the opportunity to form a nation. And then, this led to conflict because often territories were disputed between different ethnic groups and different language groups. So anyway, nationalism is important for all of this. Utopian ideas we're reckoning with, in some cases rejecting, but always dealing in some way with the idea of nationalism. All right, another intellectual tradition that begins in this period are these ideas of socialism and communism. These are rather political forms, and I've got Karl Marx pictured on the left of the slide here, right? With the Industrial Revolution, the creation of this working class, an uptick in production, some philosophers, Marx in particular, came to worry a great deal about those who were being oppressed. And Marx, in examining history and examining contemporary political forces, concluded that all of history was shaped in large part by struggle between classes. Okay? And he said, we can trace this from these earlier political forms, which he labeled simply as feudalism, where there's one dominant landholder, everyone else is oppressed. Well, under capitalism, those who make things and sell things seize control of the means of production, but then they, in turn, exploit the working class. That's kind of where things were as Marx saw it, right? And so he said, the solution to this, or rather for him, it was going to be an inevitability. The ultimate result is the working class will eventually rise up in a revolution and overthrow its capitalist masters and create a society where the common people, the working class, the proletariat was his term for it, would control the means of production, and this would be a far more equal society, right? Well, that's communism, and this captured the imagination of many people. Of course, the first communist revolution happened in Russia, which Marx would not have predicted. He thought it was going to happen in a far more industrialized place like the United States or the UK or something like that. It happened in Russia, and then thereafter in many other parts of the world. Socialism and communism, it should be said very carefully, are not the same thing. Socialism is a kind of a principle of economic organization where the government takes control of sectors of the economy and administers them directly, right? And this is tremendously influential on utopian ideas because, much as we saw, going all the way back to Plato, Plato suggested that in order to have an ideal city, the government needed to control a lot of things. And the government, of course, needed to be run by philosophers, those who were already enlightened, so they would make good decisions. So government control of things, right? This was simply seen as the solution to many of the ills of society. If government was in the right hands, and that's always the problem, well, it could do the best job administering those sectors of the economy that led to the greatest inequality or other problems, right? Well, socialism, of course, would be used by governments or rather, people operating from diverse political ideologies, everything from fascism in the 1920s and 1930s in places like Italy and Germany, right? This is very much a rightist form of government, autocracy, right, to the type of government that's about as far left as you can go, which is the communism of the Soviet Union. These both use socialism as a means to an end, which is to, in their minds, to create an ideal society. Right, so these are potential forces in utopian thinking, and they're embraced by a lot of different thinkers and even a lot of different kind of experiments. Okay, a few others. Progressivism is the idea that things are always getting better. Now, we've encountered the notion of progress and why it's problematic for thinking about history already, but progressivism is an ideology largely of the modern Western world, right, which supposes that human beings simply tend toward progress. that they're always going to build on the things that came before. Progressivism really kind of took over ideas about history. I mean, Marxism itself is progressivist in the sense that it moves from a lower state to a higher state, as Marx sees it, right? Feudalism to capitalism to communism. That's a progressive ideology. Anthropologists and others seized upon this too to suggest that human beings move initially from a state of savagery to eventually to a state of barbarism, and finally to a state of civilization. There's a great deal of optimism as a result of the discoveries of the scientific revolution that lead into these progressive notions, right? And this influences in turn utopian experimentation and utopian ideas, right? The idea, and we see this maybe most especially in Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, right? In that book, the main character falls asleep, kind of like Rip Van Winkle, except he sleeps a lot longer, sleeps for over 100 years, and wakes up in a world where, people have figured things out, right? They've instituted a strict socialist system, and life is so much better. They have progressed beyond the petty problems that animated life, 100 years before. So that's a very progressivist work. Now, one thing that we should mention here or identify is this period known as the Gilded Age. This is most common used to describe the United States of the late 19th and very early 20th century, really kind of before the First World War. But it could be applied to Europe as well. Because the Industrial Revolution led to an exponentially larger and more productive economy, there was a lot more wealth to be had, but this wealth was not equally shared, as we've already seen. That problem of inequality is one of the animating factors of politics in this period, and certainly one of the key factors in utopian thinking. And so the Gilded Age produces these utopian visions. Looking Backward very much is a product of the Gilded Age. Arguably, so is H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. And so is the film Metropolis to a great extent, right? Concerns of people in the Gilded Age were that there were a small elite who controlled almost everything, who owned all of the factories, who controlled the vast majority of all of the wealth of the world, and that most people had no access to this. This produced in turn something called the Progressive Age, which was a period of a lot of reforms, sort of culminating in the New Deal and things like that during the Great Depression. And so, we should be aware of these concerns that existed during the Gilded Age and kind of the status of society du jour. Final point here. Warfare changed with industrialization. Arguably, the 18th and early 19th centuries are the golden age of strategic warfare. This is the period when generals could sit, in their tents with maps and topographical readings and sort of scientific instruments out in front of them and plot with grand strategy how the battles would go, right? That we need to station this many soldiers here, this many platoons, and have them at this point in the battle fire their cannons, and then have these cavalrymen charge at this direction, and we know the enemy's going to be here, and it's just a great deal of strategy, right? The weapons were well suited for this. You have artillery in the form of cannons and mortars and long guns and things. But then, the rifles that the soldiers actually carried were not so efficient that they could, fire more than once or twice before they would be forced to use their bayonets or perhaps pull out their sabers or something like that. In other words, the technology had not yet become so destructive that human beings were almost worthless on an individual level on the battlefield. That changes by the end of the 19th century. Really, the American Civil War is in some ways a barometer for this. The American Civil War, you have in the initial phases of the war, at places like Manassas and Antietam, and even Gettysburg to some extent, which is somewhat later in the war, these grand strategy kinds of battles playing out, right? Where generals could make decisions, order his men to do certain things that would tip the balance of the battlefield. By the end of that war, both sides were digging trenches, using Gatling guns, mowing down soldiers who tried to cross this area between the trenches, which was called no man's land, colloquially. And the warfare just became incredibly destructive. You have, the application of industrial technology to warfare. It takes a while for the social and, we might say, military imagination to catch up with this, even in the First World War. In fact, that's kind of the tipping point in this, right? You still have these soldiers pretending that they're Napoleon or Wellington, with their maps saying we need to send horses charging across no man's land to take that position, and then they simply get mown down by machine guns or stopped by barbed wire or these other things that are relatively cheap to produce, but which are just incredibly destructive. This leads to a great disenchantment with warfare. Warfare had been this heroic enterprise that people would undertake to gain glory, to bring glory to the nation. This is bound up in many ways with nationalism. Well, it ceases to be glorious, and that leads to a great disenchantment. We might almost say a depression that happens, especially in Europe after the First World War. And this is one of the key factors in the production of dystopian visions of the world, which we will engage when we talk about the 20th century. All right, so now, like I said, this is just a collection of ideas and forces and institutions and things that all bore in some way on utopian thinking. Hopefully you can identify how the context shaped these things that you're reading and researching. So please feel free to ask discussions on the discussion board, reach out personally if you want to talk. Happy to continue this conversation elsewhere. Thanks.